Welcome to another episode of Invigorate Your Business with George Stroumboulis. Today, I sit down with Fotini Iconomopoulos. She is an international negotiations expert. She is an author, she is a speaker, and a strategist. She has been published in every imaginable publication around the world. She has been featured on television programs, morning talk shows for her advice, for her expertise in the arena of negotiation. She is a powerhouse. We're going to cover a lot of topics. We're going to get some powerful advice from her as well. So enjoy this episode starting now. My name is George Stroumboulis, and I'm extremely passionate about traveling the world, meeting new people, and learning about new businesses. Join me as I sit down with other entrepreneurs to learn about their journeys. This episode of Invigorate Your Business starts now. We're going to get it started. We're in Toronto, Canada, hometown, amazing city, sitting here with a powerhouse, author, speaker, negotiations expert, childhood friend, all-around great person, Fotini Iconomopoulos. Thank you for sitting down with me. Very excited to just go into everything. We obviously have background, work, and childhood, right? But professionally, you've been just exploding over the years. I've seen just everything that you're doing. We've talked personally about it. Seeing you from the corporate world, working for brands like L'Oreal and Smuckers. Yes, Smuckers. And then negotiating with clients like Walmart, and then going to work for a negotiations company, and then starting your own firm, and just seeing that. And then while doing this, becoming a very well-known, reputable speaker in the space, right? Talking to different industries, different walks of life, and tying in the art of negotiation. So it's incredible what you've been able to do. Thank you for sitting down with me, and welcome.
Well, thank you. It's so bizarre to be sitting with someone who knows so much of my history.
Too much.
I wouldn't say that. I think you're good at keeping things that need to be kept in the vault.
Yes, that's true. That's true.
But it is really weird to be doing these types of conversations that I do all the time, but with someone who knows so much of the backstory and has watched the entire evolution. So
entire,
cool.
Start to finish, yeah. And we keep seeing it. And we're going to get into this, but you also have an amazing book. I've seen, before this book even came out, I experienced it with my company, just how you approach negotiations, right? And I know it's a big term. I think it's more communication,
yes,
right? Like you are a communications expert. And even stuff that we've learned that you've talked about has helped me in my business with my team, right? And negotiating and discussing and just really understanding that people have a background and how do you leverage that to get what you need and just kind of making sure everybody wins. That's something that resonated with me. So just talk to me in general. How do you go from where you work corporate wise to becoming, a negotiations expert?
I mean, the easy answer is it was lazy because my entire career has been very passive. It's been people going, we think you should do this. So I was recruited out of my MBA. L'Oreal recruited me and it was great. And then this other company recruited me. And then I was being trained to be a more effective negotiator. So this training company came in and said, you should really be doing what we do. And I was like, yeah, sure. Okay. Someday when I have more experience. And it took them a year of convincing me to come on board and join them. And I joined them for a long time. And then my clients went, why aren't you doing this thing on your own? When I quit that job because it wasn't serving me anymore, the clients are the ones that convinced me to do something. I had no intention of becoming self-employed, but I was working with some very big clients that I'm bound by NDAs about. So some of the biggest companies in the world that I can't tell you that I worked with were going, when are you going to come back and work with us? And I'd say, but I don't work for that company anymore. They said, we didn't hire the company. We hired Fotini. We want to work with you. And so I just kept saying yes because these clients had become friends and I thought I'd do a favor to a friend and then I'll do this until I have to get a real job. And lo and behold, 10 years later, it's a real job. I can admit it after being, again, invited to, can you come teach at your alma mater and teach MBA negotiations? Okay. HarperCollins rang and said, we saw a video of you online. We think you have a book in you. And I was like, all right. So I've never chased it. I just feel like I put myself in positions where I enjoy what I'm doing. I light up doing what I'm doing. And people see that. And clearly I'm delivering some value because they keep inviting me back.
Yes.
And they keep sharing that with other folks. So I've never really had to actively market myself in anything. It's just been doing the things that are really cool to do, saying yes to stuff that sounds really cool. And it just keeps leading to even better things.
Yeah, it's incredible. Did you even think being on TV, getting on stage, sharing this message, and it's always tailored for each audience. It's not the same message to everybody. It's tailored for each industry. Did you even see that? Were you manifesting that back in the day?
No.
Like when the book came up, did you ever say, I'm going to write a book, I'm going to be a professor, I'm going to teach, or like everything just kind of?
The answer to all of that is no.
No.
Like I had clients saying to me, when are you going to write a book? I'm like, yeah, sure, whatever. It was just kind of one of those things where until it was in front of me, I never dreamed it up. I didn't know that professional speaking was a career. I didn't know you could get paid to be on those stages. Like whenever I went to conferences and stuff, it was, you know, the VPs of our company and that kind of thing. So I never saw anybody entertaining on stage and teaching at the same time. So until a client said, hey, can you come speak at our national sales meeting? I was like, yeah, okay, I can do that. I mean, I do this stuff in the classroom in a room full of people all the time. Why wouldn't I do it in an auditorium full of people? Just none of these things were even, there was no iota of it on my brain. It was until I was exposed to it, I didn't know it was an opportunity for me.
Wow. But you said that like, yeah, I speak in boardrooms and everything. Why not do it on stage? That's a big jump, right? To sit here and talk to 10, 15 executives is one thing. You still have to be sharp. You need to know your numbers. You need to know everything. I understand that. But to take that and go on stage, hundreds of people, and not just hundreds of people, like executives, leaders, across the board, not just here in Toronto, across the country, you know, across the United States, you've done stuff internationally. That's not an easy jump.
But yet I was practicing with those muscles from the time I was a kid.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you know, I was the lead in the school musicals. I was doing speech competitions as a kid. I remember my godfather and my dad showing up to my speech competitions when I was at, you know, the regional championships or something like that. I represented our church down in the States. I was representing Canada at a speech competition when I was 15. This stuff was easy for me. That didn't give me anxiety. Like public speaking never gave me anxiety the way it did others. Stepping on a stage to sing in a musical and all that kind of stuff never gave me anxiety. That was stuff that brought me joy, that lit me up. The same way, you know, sports can light someone else up. That just really worked for me. So now all of a sudden I get to marry these skills I already had with the knowledge bank that I was developing and sharing it in just a new outlet for me.
Yeah, absolutely. So when you get on stage, let's just talk about that. How does that, you get on stage, you're obviously prepared, right? You always walk in there and you know what you're going to talk about. Is a lot of it interactive? Like when you're...
So I try to make it as interactive as possible in the sense that, number one, I know who's in my audience. So I have a download call with a client to go, tell me about the people in the audience. Like what's keeping them up at night? What's their day-to-day like, so that I can put myself in their shoes. So I might have a speech that's 80% prepared, but then, and I can pick and choose which principles do I think, because I have a big library in my head of which are the ones that I think are going to be most relevant for this group. But then that other 20% is still going to be connecting the dots for them of these principles that I'm teaching and how is it affecting their lives. So when I can reference something about their daily lives, when I can connect with them in a way that helps them to understand, I see you, that is what's going to be far more compelling than me just talking at them and just lecturing at them all the time. Right. And then when they're sitting in that audience, I try to do exercises with them so that they feel they're connecting with me. Whether it's something as simple as like, you know, raise a hand or asking them a question and asking them to answer it and write it down. So it's almost feeling like we're having a conversation and it's not just someone talking over you.
Yes.
That's the feeling I want people to have. So it felt like they got something out of it personally, as opposed to sometimes we get in there, we just hear a whole bunch of content and we have to figure, okay, which of these things is finally going to work for me? If they can walk out feeling like it connected the dots for them and what I'm saying and how this connects to their real life, and it's something actionable that they can implement immediately, then I've done my job.
Yeah, absolutely. We worked with you right before COVID, right? Flew down to New York. We had our small executive team, which was from operations, from production, from warehousing. We had a cross section from our team, and it was a crash course, right? Because we were limited on time, and you presented and you gave us a lot of real, like just tangible skill set when you're negotiating. And at the time we were working with a big co-working space and we were trying to nail the contract. And there was stuff that genuinely we were able to sit there with my business partner and apply, you know, the next day. And then I would see a couple other individuals after, you know, one of them's like, man, she's a boss. And it was very well received. But seeing you present and trying to separate childhood friendship to, wow, she really is impressive, like how you communicate. But then you were tying in different exercises where you're sitting there and applying it to your business. Even though that was a crash course, it was so well received, right? And seeing that. And then from there you go, you launch your book, you're doing all this stuff. Go back to the stage. Let's just talk about when you're on there. Have you ever had any situations where you're like, I didn't prepare enough. I could do better here. Are you evaluating in real time?
I am, yeah.
Okay.
And you totally are. I would say my worst stage experience, which the audience wouldn't ever know it was worst because my bar is very high, was coming out of COVID. I was doing a lot of virtual presentations. And I actually really enjoyed them because I found ways, because people are like, oh God, virtual, I have to sit here and listen to someone for an hour. And even the clients were like, how do you get them to not tune out and start doing other things on their computer? But I find ways to keep it engaging, to use the chat, to force people to think about things. And so I actually really enjoyed it. But I also enjoyed it because I had so many crutches. I could see my entire speech. I had Post-it notes around me. Like, people didn't see what was on the other side of the camera. Right. So I didn't have to prepare as hard for that as I would on stage, where you don't have any cue cards and things like that. That's not how I speak. There are other people who sit at a podium. That is not my thing. I'm moving around the stage. I'm sweating by the end of it because there's so much energy. It's like a workout. But my first gig after COVID, when at my very first in-person conference, was the worst gig I ever did. And it was because I was like, I know this. I've done it so much. I wrote a new speech during the pandemic so that I was using it and doing it virtually over and over again. I thought I knew it really well. And I thought I wasn't using my crutches at home. Turned out I was. Because that clock said 60 minutes because you have a little shot clock at the bottom. Okay. And I was like, I'm only approaching 45 minutes and I'm done all my content. I thought I had 60 minutes, but I forgot entire chunks of it. So I didn't prepare as well as I had. And I was scrambling on stage to go, okay, what other bits do I have that I can perform for them now? So in my head, I'm just coming up with like greatest hits kind of thing to add on to the tail end of this. So they didn't know because it was still useful. But in my world, I didn't take them on the same journey that I would have had I prepared more effectively. And that was a big awakening for me. So that was, I believe, I want to say early 2022. The rest of 2022 was gangbusters. Okay. Like it kicked me into gear. It was like going back to the gym and getting in shape again kind of thing. And every gig after that just got better and better because I put a new energy behind preparing. So that in 2023, I went on this cross-country tour for the Art of Leadership tour. And I have never prepared so well for a gig in my life. Really? To the point where I felt like I was on fire. I felt like I could see every face in the audience and I was connecting with every person in the audience and my stories were resonating. And it meant it was less mental energy to remember what I was going to say and more energy that I could put into the telling of the stories and connecting with the audience. So that bad experience in 2022 really made me level up for the rest of what was coming after. Well, you're very fortunate. If that's your worst experience and it was basically internal, you knew because you were 15 minutes short, that's impressive, right? And to come out of that. So when you're presenting and you see all this, how do you keep coming up with fresh material? How do you keep staying relevant? Like if you're talking to a room of insurance executives and then you're talking to a women's leadership group and how do you tailor that? Yeah, so it's not so much about fresh material as it is relevant material. Okay. And I think that's the key word there. How do you make it relevant for those folks? Because yesterday I was with a group of women scientists at a Center of Addiction and Mental Health. They do not do sales negotiations. There's no numbers being thrown across the table, but they are negotiating for help on a grant. They're negotiating for their voice to be heard in a room. Before that, I was with a bunch of nurses, anesthesiologists who are negotiating in the operating room with your surgeon about the safety of the patient and so on. Those are much higher stakes negotiations than the billion-dollar deals that I'm dealing with in boardrooms. And so it's just about going, okay, which are the principles? There's going to be some similarities in every single one of those negotiations. Which are the principles that are going to be most valuable for this group? And most of the time, it's a lot of the same ones because it's managing conflict on a daily basis. So how do you get your message heard? How do you get them to feel acknowledged? Those are the same principles that are going to work everywhere, but it's helping give people the context in terms of how to use them. One of my favorite things about the stage, though, is I always try to reserve, when they give me enough time, I try to reserve going, okay, I'm going to give you, let's say, 30 minutes to 45 minutes of keynoting, and then the next 15 is going to be Q&A. So because that solidifies it in their brain. And I am one of I don't know everybody's this comfortable, but I love doing Q&As. Right. So even podcasts and stuff like that, I always tell people, you don't need to, prep me in advance. I don't need to see the questions in advance. I think there's some magic that happens in my brain when I haven't seen those questions. Yes. And so I light up, and my friends have told me in audiences, they're like, oh my God, you were totally lighting up when the Q&A started. It's like a new smile comes on my face. That's your zone right there. Yeah, I feel like I'm in the zone because I can go, when they give me a scenario, a context, a specific question, I go, oh yes, here's how I can help you connect it. Remember that thing I said earlier? Here's how it works for that scenario. And it brings me such joy and satisfaction to know I finished the story, like I completed the circle for them, and they can finally make that specific connection. So that for me is the differentiator. No matter what industry I'm in, I can connect that material for them. And if I have the chance to do it in their words, answering their specific questions, I just think there's some magic that happens there.
Yeah. And you put yourself out there a lot, like social media, you utilize it a lot, right? And that, hey, ask me your questions. Yeah. It doesn't matter. It doesn't have to be a boardroom or a large conference room. It could be the mother or the husband or whatever, asking a question on, I'm trying to negotiate better airfare tickets. Like I always see that. I love that you connect with people like that, because like you said, negotiation, making sure you achieve what you want, it applies to all different industries, to everything. You're excellent at doing that. Talk to me about your book. Say less, get more. Obviously, I'm a fan and I support friends, right? So that's one side of it. But the big thing was, I truly believe in what you do. It really has helped me in my business when we were exposed to it. I remember when this first came out, everyone in my company got it. You were awesome. Message for everyone. You personally knew everyone in my company when we did it. But it's been incredible. It's a very easy read in that it makes sense. It's broken down with the examples and everything. We enjoyed it. The feedback has been great. Talk to me about the book specifically, going to the point to even write a book, right? How does that industry even work? Like, just walk us down that path.
I've learned a lot about the book industry.
I could imagine.
I'm not sure I would do things the same way, but I'm grateful that they unraveled the way that they did. I don't know that I would have written one if HarperCollins hadn't come knocking. So they literally emailed me and said, actually I had a friend email me saying, I just shared your information with my editor over at HarperCollins. I hope that's okay. And then I got an email from HarperCollins later that day going, so-and-so gave me your information. We saw a video of you online and we know we've heard your name a few times before. We'd love to have a conversation. So I went into the HarperCollins office and then they said, we think you have a book in you. I said, I'm flattered, but why? There's a million negotiation books out there. I've read a lot of them. Yep. And they said, we just think you have a voice that people need to hear. And that resonated with me because I'd read so many books and there's some really great ones out there. And most of the time I'm picking and choosing pieces that work for me because a lot of the time, and now, I told you my worst stage experience, but I've had way worse work experiences when I show up to a room full of people who do not want to be there. Their bosses force them to be there. They look at a young woman. I was less than 30 when I started doing this. And they looked at me and they literally said the words, what are you going to teach me, little girl? Jeez. So I've walked into a lot of those rooms and I've gotten advice from people who don't look like me and say, just say this. And it didn't work. It backfired. And so when you're reading books written by people who don't look or sound like you have to pick and choose the ones that are going to work and that are not going to work. And I knew from experience that not everything worked. I worked in an organization where I was the youngest by at least 15 years. I was the only woman on this global team doing what I did. I didn't have a posh English accent like everybody else. And so when I would walk into these rooms, these guys who I learned from, who I shadowed and so on, what worked for them was not working for me. The same script, I tell stories in the book, the same script was just not working for me. And when I told them that, they didn't get it. And I had a similar experience. Even when I was working for L'Oreal, one of my friends was the highest paid account manager there. So when my promotion was coming up, he coached me through that negotiation. I was in my early 20s. And I said exactly what he said, what he told me he said in his negotiation, and it backfired. And I was like, he's like, Fo, I'm so sorry. I don't understand it. I did exactly the same thing. I'm like, it came from you and it didn't come from me.
But what do you mean? Is that because of age? Is that because of sex? Like what is it?
All of the above. So there is a lot of bias in negotiation. And so I experienced it and then I started to read about it and I was like validated because there's a lot of bias. There's gender bias massively. There's color bias. There's age bias. So we know it, women in the workplace know about all of these biases because we experience them so much. Sure. People with privilege don't experience it quite as much. And if all the books out there are written by people with privilege, they're going to have some blind spots about those little things. So when I read stuff from some of the really big name bestseller guys who say something like, use your late night FM DJ voice. I'm like, that inauthenticity is not going to fly with me. Or use this phrase. And I'm like, that would never work coming from me. And so my goal was, and this is something that I think HarperCollins really hit on, was to use a voice that's going to be applicable for everybody. And so the analogy I use in the book and that I use in my everyday life is it's the on-ramp versus the stairs. Those of us who are able-bodied, who are privileged enough to be able-bodied, can use the stairs every single day. But there's a few people who are going to be left out. The on-ramp, however, is going to work for everybody. We can walk it, people can roll it, and so on. So how could I make this book the one that's going to be useful for everybody so no one feels left out of it? So I factored in some of the bias that I experienced. I factored in the bias that I read about. I factored in some of the other things that have come across my desk over the years. And my hope was that it's also not biased for people who are in a boardroom. Right. So I have examples of negotiating with kids.
Yes.
I have examples of negotiating in boardrooms. I have examples of some of the really crazy corporate stuff I have like these anonymous companies. I can't tell you who they are, even though I really want to. I have all of these different examples so that it hopefully applies to every walk of life. One of the working titles we were going to come up with was From Boardroom to Bedroom, but it sounded a little too cheeky and I didn't really want to go there.
Sales would have been 3x. I'm just letting you know.
So it was that element of how do we make this useful for everybody? How do we use language that's not too overly academic? Because I've read those books too. That's going to make it an easy read. That's going to have, markers in the middle of it to remind you of the things that you just read.
I love that.
Borrowing from the academic world where I saw that in textbooks and that was really useful for my students. So I wanted to make sure that was an element that I included. There's all of these and stories, lots of stories. Like the epilogue, I was almost done the book. It took a year of writing. It was awful.
Right.
And I think anybody who's ever read a book will tell you it is awful and it's also the most rewarding thing at the same time.
And no ChatGPT. For everyone listening.
That was before ChatGPT. So it took me a year of writing in coffee shops on the weekends, on airplanes during the week. So I was working full time like crazy, like racking up air miles. And it was before Wi-Fi was on planes too. So it was actually a great time to tune out and just focus. But it took a year of doing that, of evenings and weekends. And finally I finished it and it wasn't totally complete. And I felt like I needed to include some more of the downsides, like some of my own failures or what happens when it doesn't work out. Because not everything's always going to be perfect. And the epilogue became this huge piece of the book too, because I started sharing more and more of my stories in there as well. And it wasn't just, okay, everything is perfect, but even the ones that went badly, something good came out of it. All because I went through the act of negotiating versus never knowing, versus sitting on the sidelines, versus being perceived as somebody who is weak or doesn't know how to advocate for themselves. So my hope is that people will attempt it and advocate for themselves. And even if it goes badly, I've given them the tools to have a safety net. So they're not going to damage relationships along the way. They may not get what they want 100% of the time, but they're going to get it a lot of the time. And the ones that don't work out, there's no damage done.
Exactly.
That was the real goal, because people will refrain. They fear damaging relationships. They fear looking stupid. So they just don't try at all. But I can give you ways to try it without failing.
Yes. And it appeals to, like you said before, everyone. Everything's a negotiation. Everything's a discussion. It's all about communication. I want to hear just the business side of it. So you write this amazing book. How does the business side work of books?
Yeah. So I had a very backwards experience. So it's very rare that people will come to you and ask you to write a book unless you're a celebrity. That just doesn't happen. So I had a very unique experience. And most of the time, people are writing book proposals and trying to shop them around to publishers. So I didn't even have an agent because I didn't need one. Agents are there to help you negotiate. Now, this is what I do. So it was when I'm getting the offer, it was too late in the game to even get an agent. And because I know how to negotiate, I just needed to know the knowledge that the agents would have. And so I was given the advice, which I'm really grateful for, to get an entertainment lawyer who is going to have this knowledge bank, who's seen a lot of contracts and stuff like that before. I started talking to other people who had gone through the weird process that I was unfamiliar with, who told me about other publishing houses and what their contracts were like and all of that kind of stuff. So that theoretically, what I should have done is I should have said, well, if you're interested, then all of these other guys should be interested. I should be shopping myself around.
Right.
But my friends had already done that. So I knew people in that world who'd already done it. And they're like, here's what I liked about these guys. And here's what I liked about these guys. And I was just sold on the team who approached me because some of my friends had published with them and said they were just wonderful. And, Kate, who is the one that approached me, really is a wonderful human being. And I can't imagine getting started in this without her.
Yes.
And so I didn't need to do that piece of the project. And then I signed the deal with HarperCollins and you pretty much sign your life away. But what people don't recognize is unless you are that celebrity who's getting $1 million advances, and people like me do not get $1 million advances, the onus is on you to do the marketing.
Okay.
So even though theoretically you have this big publishing house behind you, they don't have much to offer you because they've been trimmed down and trimmed down and trimmed down, and their budgets go to the Michelle Obamas. Their budgets go to, those salacious biographies and stuff like that. They don't go to people like me. Okay. And they don't go to most people in general. So every author I know, and I'm very grateful to now have a really cool network of them, everybody had warned me, you need to start marketing early. And I don't think I started marketing early enough. So the marketing really does fall on your shoulders, making sure people know it's coming, making sure you're getting as much PR as possible out of it, maybe even hiring PR companies. So I did briefly hire a PR company down in the States because I already had PR in Canada. Like I had been on every show in Canada multiple times before I even had a book deal. So it was just a regular thing to go have a conversation with, the Canadian talk shows and the morning shows and all that kind of stuff. But because in the States, the corporate giants knew me behind closed doors and I couldn't tell people that I was working with them.
Right.
In the media world, they didn't know me quite as well. So I did hire somebody to help me down there to open up some doors. And that's how I got on like Business Insider and CNN and things like that in those headlines.
Yeah, major.
So that's a lot of work. And I'd say that's a full-time job in itself. And I didn't dedicate nearly enough time to it that I should have.
You're still paying bills and doing
You're
conferences.
doing your day job.
Yeah.
And then on top of that, you're literally the machine behind the book. Every author is the machine behind the book. And I have met so many people since mine came out too and watched their journeys because I think there might be a book 2 in me. I just don't know what it is yet.
Well, that was going to be one of my questions. Of course there is,
but
right?
It's mentally preparing myself, not just for the content, which I'm still sorting through in my own brain, but what is that process going to look like this time? Because I'm going to clean up the process and it's going to start a lot earlier.
Yes.
And it's just going to have so many more elements to it. And it might not be with a big publisher. It actually might be hybrid because now there's so many ways to publish a book. So you can go with what we call the big publishers. And there's so much amalgamation that there's very few of them left. You can go with the self-publishing route of like literally print on demand. Anybody can put a book out on Amazon. And maybe it's good quality, maybe it's not. There's so many more choices and decisions to make about even the quality of the paper and the colors and all of that kind of stuff. And now there's this new universe that has really picked up speed in hybrid publishing. So it's kind of a la carte. So you don't have to do the behind the scenes stuff of figuring out the Amazon things. You have people who know all the things that the major publishing houses do, but now you get to choose. Oh, do you need this much marketing help? Do you need this much editorial help? Do you need this much? And you can spend as little or as much as you want on it. The more you spend, obviously, the better return you're going to get on it in terms of things getting out the door, in terms of profitability.
Right.
Like published authors make a pittance on the actual royalties per book. Most of the income from a book comes from the advance up front. So most authors will be given a sum of money. And then as you sell books, the amount of this advance, it's chipped away because per book you make such an amount. So and
you're paying it back?
Theoretically. Yeah. So most authors don't actually out earn their advance. So it's very rare that you get another check.
So you're in debt forever until that's
done. You're not
done.
really in debt. It's yours. They're advancing it to you, knowing that there's never going to be a payback to that advance. The expectation or the hope is that you're going to earn it all. And then someday you're going to earn even more because you've exceeded those thousands of dollars that they gave you.
Right.
A lot of even celebrity authors don't exceed those $1 million advances. And that's kind of known. It's part of the formula going in because you make such a teeny amount per book, a tiny percentage per book. Whereas if you go hybrid, yes, you're spending money up front to get your book published, but you're making way more per book. So those very tiny numbers of percentages become massive percentages. So if you have faith in yourself, for example, that you could sell like 5,000 books, you could spend a hefty amount on that upfront fee and make it all back and then some.
Right.
So it's about knowing the numbers. You really need to understand what are those numbers? What is your faith in how many of those books you're going to move? Like we've sold well over 10,000 copies.
That's
kind of the marker.
Amazing.
In my universe, that's the marker of a bestseller. That's what I'm told.
Yeah.
So that's great, especially in a small market like Canada. So again, cross-border stuff became even more complicated because I'm supported in Canada, but it's a distribution system in the US. And if you've got great connections and stuff and you've got the support of a great distribution network, then it's easier. But most of these books move because I'm on stage and people in my audiences are the ones that are buying them. They don't know who I am. They're not seeking me out as an author because most people don't know who I am until they meet me.
Right.
But when I get on stage, I even remember during the virtual launch of it, I was doing these virtual keynotes and in the chat, I'd be seeing people sharing the link. I just bought her book and then 10 more people and then 50 more people.
That's
and,
awesome.
and it's great to see it's resonating with them. But that's where the fan base comes from for me. And that's why authors like me don't get massive advances. They don't get the millions. If they know an author is going to have a huge fan base, the advance can go up because they have more faith in that as well. So it's a very interesting business because you can choose how much control you have over it. But when you sign with a publisher, a big publisher, you lose a lot of control. Even for me, I can't get this book for free. I pay the group rate that everybody else, if I want to buy some books, I get the same discount that my audience members get when they buy, hundreds of copies of the book for everybody. Right. So it's not like I'm getting it for free. So if I want to send everybody a book, it's going to cost me $10 a book to be able to do that.
I see stuff you don't know, like the insight you just gave us now on how this works. What is the benefit of going with a big publisher other than, hey, I'm published with this company because you can self-publish, you go to your venue, you impress everybody, and you have a great social media following, right? Like I feel it's truly a community.
It's small but mighty.
but it's a community though. It's supportive. It's everything. You come out with your next book. Here it is. Like here's all the content there.
So the benefit of going with a big publisher is when you don't know the ropes like me, it's a great way to learn on someone else's dime. So it didn't cost me anything to write this book. Now I did use the advance for PR and for some other stuff and actually get a website up because I was kind of going incognito all these years in my business. For 10 years, I almost didn't have a website. It was just word of mouth of like big person moves from big company. They bring I'm working with one client right now. This is the third company I've worked with her at because she just keeps bouncing into these executive roles and saying, we need to get our team, ready for this next negotiation. That's great. But, I needed to become a bit more polished in terms of my exposure out there and stuff like that as well in order to attract the right people who are going to buy the book. So there's the benefit of the fact that the publisher has the network, they have the distribution channels, they have all that stuff. Are they going to support you or do you have to fight for that kind of support? That's another factor to think about. Now, for me, the whole marketing story of saying they approached me is huge. That's super valuable for my brand.
It's so impressive.
And I make sure everybody knows that.
Of course. And they should, right? Is that why you got the tattoo here?
But that for me is the big value. A lot of authors want to do it because of the ego and the credibility piece of it. And there's some credibility to say HarperCollins or Random House or any of those folks published it. But I'm not convinced these days that consumers know or care who published your book. And it used to be back in the day when you were self-published, it was a ratty looking book.
Right.
Back then. It wasn't great quality. And so when you saw it on shelf or you held it in your hands, you're like, what is this? It looks like I pasted it together in my garage kind of thing. That's not the case today. So the quality has gone up significantly. The ability to churn stuff out has changed a lot. The a la carte ability to do things in that hybrid way. And these hybrid publishers have come a long way and they have marketing expertise. They're not, when you're with a publishing house who says, this is our marketing department and it's teeny tiny, or you'll get a publicist and basically it's an email with the name of the publisher and maybe that'll get more traction than your own personal email. But now you can pay for that stuff. You can pay for the cover art, for the marketer, you can even pay to have your stuff in the airport. Now, HarperCollins can choose or not choose to pay to have my stuff sitting in the airport kiosks. Whereas if you're self-publishing or hybrid publishing, you can choose to spend that money. You can say, 10 grand is a good use of cash because I know I'm going to sell this many more books or get it into this many more hands. You get to decide that ROI. When you're working with a big publisher, you're handing that decision to them. But there's a cost to deciding that.
But there's a cost, yeah.
So it's really about managing, how much mental load am I willing to take on? How much credibility do I really need? And so on and so forth. And then measuring that ROI.
You should be so proud that they approached you. They saw a clip. Like that's a big deal, right? Because everyone wants to do something. 10,000 plus books sold. That's incredible. Like I always try to put, when I hear numbers or views or whatever, it's like, imagine them in a room or in a stadium. That's half a Scotiabank Arena has paid money holding this and has read your advice they know about you. That's incredible.
It's still mind blowing to me. It's bizarre.
Yeah. 10, incredible. And I hope it reaches 100,000 and more, right? So from a question standpoint, you've been on every talk show here in Canada. You've been published in magazines, newspapers, everything. What's the most common question that you always get asked across the board? Because you get asked from different walks of life. Oh, teach me how to do this. What's the biggest question or questions that you get and the misconception when it comes to negotiation? Because when I hear negotiation early on, you're like, okay, it's aggressive. Someone's going to win something. Someone's going to lose something. Like there's often negativity associated with.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah. There is a negative connotation associated with the word negotiation. People assume it's going to be very combative.
Yeah.
And there are some of those, but more commonly, it actually has the opportunity to be collaborative. There's still going to be the occasional combative thing, and that's often why people pay me big bucks to come into boardrooms and help them deal with those things. But most of the stuff that we deal with on a day-to-day basis doesn't have to feel so win-lose. It actually might be win-lose. You're going to be winning perhaps more than the other party, but they don't have to feel like they lost. And so there's ways to manage the psychology behind it. These days, I read far more about psychology than I do about specifically negotiation books that are coming out. Because it's about how do people make decisions? How do people feel? If my job was to just run the numbers, I'd be out of a job because AI can do that.
Right.
But we do not make decisions based on spreadsheets. We do it based on emotion. And AI still gives me job security because it has not figured out the human emotion thing. And so we will do things to spite ourselves just because they've pushed our buttons in the wrong way. So we're ruled more by our emotions than we are by our logic. And that is why you need to understand people when it comes to negotiation. And one of the things that people tell me is the reason they fear negotiation. In fact, I ask questions when I run workshops, and I can't remember if I do it with you, but I've been doing it for years now. I go around the room and I ask people, what is your biggest fear about negotiating? Because there's always one. Doesn't matter if you're the most experienced president, CEO, all of that kind of stuff. Everybody has a fear. There's two things that come up. One is, I don't want to look stupid. I don't want to leave something on the table because our egos are fragile. And the overriding one is, I don't want to damage a relationship. So the questions that come up as a result of that fear are, what happens if they get mad at me? What happens if they renege the offer? What happens if I piss them off? That is the fear that's driving these most common questions for me. And so people are holding back because they worry about damaging relationships. And my whole point is to go, you actually don't have to be damaging them. In fact, you could be building relationships. By advocating for yourself in a way that people respect you, you could actually be gaining their respect and some likability in the process. So I always tell people, especially my students, like when I get MBA students reaching out to me about salary negotiations all the time, they're so fearful. Many of them are so fearful of negotiating these rates because they're like, what if I lose the job? What if they take it back? I'm like, if you are doing things in a cooperative way, if you are doing things in a way that makes you curious and empathetic and are approaching it in a problem-solving technique as opposed to maybe the old school way of banging your fist on the table, some of those archaic bestsellers that tell you the art of, they're not so great because they don't apply today in this universe that just doesn't work. But there are ways to approach it so that worst case, they say, no, we can't afford it, but they're not going to renege it because you're not being a jerk and they still want to find a way to work with you. And they may even feel bad that they can't meet all of your demands, but you'll find something. Maybe it's not now, maybe it's in the future. And so the big question is, how do I make sure I don't damage those relationships? And the answers are really simple in the book. It's just about not trying to be something you're not. It's not about being inauthentic and puffing out your chest and doing the things that archaically we've been told are negotiation, which is why we get these combative images that come to mind. It's about being curious. It's about treating it like a problem-solving opportunity. It's about putting yourself in the other person's shoes to go, what would be holding them back? How can we work around that problem together? How can I treat it as, a questioning problem-solving opportunity instead of an offensive or tactical one? And there's so many easy ways to do that.
Total side note, it just came to me. Have you ever thought about politics in the future?
I have been approached many times about politics. Yeah. That is not a circus I want to get into. It would be mentally exhausting.
You should be lobbying for governments. And lobbying maybe is not the word, but senior advising to governments.
I mean, that would be the only way you could ever convince me to go into politics is to work behind the scenes. Yes. But watching the way politics work is so distasteful to me because it's really just an ego, war.
In every country, right? It's a shit show.
To any place I've ever been to. It's just more of I would never run for anything, not in a million years.
Too many skeletons in the closet? Is that what it is? No,
that's
the other thing.
I've been so open about everything. It's really just the circus of it. The ego show is just not my thing. And there are some people who are great at overcoming that and getting into being in the right positions, but there's too many of those other things you have to step over to get there. But behind the scenes, maybe I could be convinced, but I get so much joy out of what I do.
You're doing,
The reward would have to be so good. And I don't mean monetary reward, but I'd have to feel really good about what I'm doing. Yeah. And right now there's so many other outlets where I get that intrinsic joy.
Absolutely. There's so many different areas we could go. Fees in general, right? Mm-hmm. When it comes to pricing, whether it's, your salary, trying to secure a purchase order, trying to get a quote, how do you handle your fees in general? So, work for us, give us a discount. How do you work that psychologically? How do you make sure you get the fees that you deserve and you approach that in general?
So, I mean, I always reevaluate my fees every year to go, okay, how busy am I? If I'm so in demand that I'm too busy, then clearly I'm not charging enough. Because if I have the ability to say yes to everything, then that's a different story. But if I have to turn stuff down, then maybe I should be getting paid more for my time. It's supply and demand, right? Yep. So there's the elements of supply and demand of what other people in my arena are getting paid and so on. So I look at that kind of stuff to determine what are the appropriate fees. And I'm always reevaluating to go, where should that be? I'm always looking at it with the lens of, are they getting more than what they paid for? because the last thing I want to do is get on stage and people go, that was okay.
Yeah.
But I want them to feel like, wow, we totally got our value out of that woman. Like, I want them to feel really good about the investment they've made with me. Otherwise, I'm not doing a very good job, and I'm not going to get invited or referred, or my whole business has been word of mouth.
Absolutely.
So if that word is meh, then it's not going to get me very far. And so based on all of that, I have a fee that I think is appropriate. And I will tell people, first thing I ask is, what are you looking to get? Because sometimes they want me to do a keynote. Sometimes they think they want a keynote, but they actually want a half day of training. Sometimes they say they want an amount of training, but it's actually they want consulting on a live negotiation. And there's a different way of working for all of those. So sometimes it's a certain chunk of time. Yep. Sometimes it's, a big lead up of research and all of that other kind of stuff. And so I price accordingly. People don't pay for my time. They pay for my experience. Yep. And I think that's something people really need to understand. You're not paying for 1 hour of my time when I go on stage. You're paying for the fact that I have been inside these boardrooms that you have never been in, and I've seen all of these things, and I've written the book, and I've done the research, and I've been doing this for 15 years. That's what you are paying for, not that 1 hour.
Yes.
The fact that I can get on stage for that 1 hour is because I've done all of these things.
Because you've done that. Yeah. Do you feel like you can't have more experience than what you have? Like, do you ever get to a place where you're like, I'm really lacking here on the negotiation side, or based on your portfolio of experience over the years and working for these big brands and dealing with the Walmarts of the world and so on, could you have more experience? Like, is that ever a negative where people are like, we feel like you don't have enough?
No one has ever told me you don't have enough, but I personally feel like I need to keep growing. And so I know my experience in the past has been extremely valuable, and it'll continue to be valuable. Those experiences are going to be immensely valuable for years to come. But there's other things where I feel like I need to keep learning and growing. So even if I've done, I get hired a lot for things like price increases. So a supplier that has to go negotiate with global massive retailer will call me in and say, how do we do this? They're going to be pissed off at us. How do we get them to approve this? And I walk them through the power dynamics, and we work on all these things. So it's a repeated negotiation I've done many times with a bunch of different companies. But I just did another one recently, and one of them was asking me, they're like, well, how do you deal with this new little nugget? This new variable that's come into the mix, this new dynamic? Maybe it's a more condensed market because there was another acquisition, and that changes the power dynamics significantly. The strategy probably won't change much, but there's going to be some minutia. There's going to be some delicate arena that I need to address so that I'm staying on top of these things as well. And it's almost like, if you're an athlete, if you're a pro level athlete, you don't stop training. You could say, I've acquired these skills. I know how to dribble a ball. I know how to shoot a basket, but you're still going to keep doing it under new conditions. Right. You're still going to be doing it to grow your skills even more, to get even faster. You don't ever become complacent, because I think complacency is death.
Yes.
Now, that doesn't mean I'm going crazy all the time either, because I'm quite comfortable in having accumulated a certain amount of experience. But there's still, I'm not going to have the immense growth that I did in the last decade, but I think there's still elements of growth that I could and should be doing. So it's about keeping my finger on the pulse of what are trends, what are new psychological findings that were happening, how can I weave those into things to make life easier for other people. So I'm always reading, I'm always listening, I'm always researching, I'm always having conversations with folks. Even though I don't do much consulting these days because I'm on the road so much, it's very hard to weave those two things into my schedule. They're just not always compatible. I still manage to squeeze in some stuff all the time, or I'm catching up with a former client who's filling me in on how things are going, and I'm still listening to, these are the things that I need to be aware of. These are the new wrinkles that we need to iron out. That for me is really important, to make sure I stay relevant, and to make sure I don't become the stale dinosaur of some of those books that have been on the bestseller list for a really long time.
Yeah. And to hear someone who's at the top of their game speaking, people are listening around the world to what you have to say and learning from that, and still hearing you say that you still want to learn, you still want to do better. Like, that's encouraging. Where you don't hear that quite often when someone's at their top of the game. It's like, no, I'm good. I'm the expert now. Let me just roll. That's encouraging. We should always want to learn more.
Yeah. I mean, and I don't suffer from imposter syndrome the way I used to, because I think everybody does to a degree.
I wanted to ask you about that. So I just booked this gig. I'm going on there, and you're sitting in the room. Early on, did you have that?
For sure I did. Okay. Yeah, for sure I did. I mean, there was definitely times where it wasn't, I wouldn't say it's as prevalent as it has been for other people, because it certainly never held me back. But there was times where I've been in that room and go, how in the hell did I get in here? But then I see them getting value out of it. And they go, and I'm like, oh, this is why I'm here. It might take me a minute to get there. But I had one client, a really huge company down in Ohio, who I had worked with in Canada before. And then this guy went down to the Ohio office, and he said, I'd really like for you to come in and consult with my team on this. And I said, but you're smart. You get it. Like, I've trained you. I've seen you in action. You don't need my help. And he goes, trust me, Fotini, we need your help down here. And I was so intimidated because it's this huge company full of people that I admire. I knew some of the people in the room, and I'm like, but they're all freaking smart. Like, I watched them use the skills that I teach. What could I possibly add in this room? And I almost said that to the client. He's like, I don't want to have to convince you that you're going to be valuable in this room. Trust me when I tell you you are. And he was a lovely client. Again, that's why we kept in touch for so many years. So he had to convince me basically to go in that room. And after 2 days of sitting, actually not even 2 days of sitting in the room, leading up to that, I did a series of phone calls of like scoping calls to go, what are everybody's perspectives? So when I walk in, I'm not going in blind. And after just those calls, I went, I can see it, right? There's still a hurdle to get over, but the hurdle's getting shorter and shorter and shorter with experience, but it's still there.
But it's still there, yeah. Do you had mentioned before real life or in life examples where you're consulting, right? Negotiation behind the scenes. What's the soonest, like what's an example of the fastest you've been brought into a situation that's happening in real time and they need to negotiate and get it out the door? Because is there onboarding that takes X weeks or months? And I'm just curious.
So it's happened to me. I remember, now it's happened super fast within days, but usually it's because I have some history with that client. And so it's very easy for me to jump in. But I remember one client probably about 12 years ago, and they brought me in. They said, we have this price increase we're going to do and this new launch that we're doing. And it's this very convoluted deal that they were going to try and push through. And they were really struggling with a massive global retailer. And so they brought me in, I think it was February, and the thing needed to be done in May. And I was like, you probably should have called me in like 2 years ago. Because it was that monumental to them, and it was going to take that much momentum to come in. And so we managed to get in a conference room in Kenosha, Wisconsin. Like, we flew everybody into one central location and spent 5 days in a boardroom there and managed to turn it around and got their objective met, and all the things that they wanted to do, they got through the price increase, the new launch, all of those things. But it took a lot. Like, we signed the contract, and the following week we were all flying to Kenosha.
Wow.
And it took a long time to in the room with them, because I didn't have the time to do the research and all that kind of stuff. So we were sort of researching in the room and working as we went. Whereas usually, clients will call me in and I'll do the onboarding stuff. I will learn, about everybody. I'll have 8 hours of phone calls just moving from one executive to the next, because somebody in finance is going to tell me something really different from someone in sales.
Yes.
And someone in marketing doesn't even hear the stuff these guys are saying. And so sometimes I'm just the conduit and I'm helping them connect their own internal dots because they have such silos up. But I can't do that unless I've done the research going in. So I talked in the book about one of my clients who brought me in, and I worked with them for 6 months. And we were working on power dynamics and literally crafting the script for every coffee meeting the executive had with the other executive. And that C-suite person needed to meet with that C-suite person. And I remember even like being in my bathtub on a Tuesday night at 7 p.m. and getting a call from this executive VP who was calling me frantically going, I don't think I can say that thing that I'm supposed to say tomorrow. And I'm talking her off a ledge and coaching her because she needed to go in for this really important meeting. So this was like 6 months of that kind of work. And then it was 18 months later, so a full 2 years from day one that I started working with them. And I only needed to work with them for 6 months, and then they carried on the rest themselves. And it was 2 years later, I was sitting on a beach in Bali, and I'm reading the headlines, and I see this big monumental negotiation. It's splashed across headlines because that's how big it was. Like, these are the things that I can't talk about.
Oh, geez.
And I emailed the president right away and I said, congratulations on closing the deal. That's really wonderful. And he was like, Fotini, we never would have been able to do it without you.
Come on.
And I'm still good friends with some of those folks in the executive boardroom. And it's an amazing friendship because we bonded over this very intense moment in their careers because it was the biggest negotiation in their company. But it was 6 months of intensive work, 2 years out from the deadline of what they were facing.
Wow.
But the higher the stakes, the earlier that preparation needs to start.
Well, and so I wanted to ask you about success, right? How do you measure success in your world? There's different avenues. You have the one-on-one behind the scene boardrooms. You have the on-stage conferences, right? You have this side. So when you're presenting to a group, how do you measure success when you're done your 60-minute keynote, that interaction? How do you know that it was a successful event? Like, are there KPIs? Is it feedback? Is it a spike in your responses? What is it?
It's really tough to find quantitative measures for my type of work. When you're doing consulting stuff, sometimes it can be quantitatively measured. Like, we need to hit this number. We need to increase the prices by this much. And if they get that price increase, they achieve it or they don't achieve it, that's success. But most of the time it's not that cut and dry, because people are like, oh, you should do like profit sharing type of stuff. But I'm like, it's not always measurable back to me. Though I did have a client years ago, it was a logistics company who said, look, how would you feel about making more money? I'm like, tell me more.
Yeah, got my attention.
Rather than just paying you your fee, what if we paid you X% of your fee? And then if we hit this hurdle we need to hit, we pay you 10% more. And I was like, well, that's interesting. And we got into a conversation about how do we make sure this hurdle is, how do we isolate this variable? And because it's logistics, is it because of gas prices? Is it because of negotiation training? Is it because of demand has gone up because there was some drought of fruit in California and they now need to bring them from Florida? Like, how do we know it's the me factor and not all these other things? It was really me doing them a favor so that it wasn't, so that they could measure properly as well. And they said, well, we have some way, and they showed me some really cool like ways that they whittled everything down and so on. And they said, if we see a 0.5% of profit increase, that's over, $60 million just like that for us. So if we can meet that 0.5% hurdle, then we'd be willing to pay you more. And then we negotiated about how much of my fee they'd pay up front and what that percentage more was. And that was a really cool negotiation because it was really meant to be as collaborative as possible, where I went, I'm going to guarantee you that amount of percentage increase. But if we don't do it based on this 2-day training, then I'm going to come back and I'm going to work with your team again until we get there, because that's how confident I was in my skill set and what I could see. Like, you can't commit to something like that without doing the research and knowing what am I getting myself into. Yes. But I went and sat in their office for a day and sat on the phone and listened to the calls right next to somebody who was having these 1-minute negotiations with truck drivers and stuff like that. I listened to all of their calls and I made notes and I was like, oh, this is an easy win and this is an easy win. And I could totally see how I could impact this group. So that was one of the only quantitative ones that I've been doing. But when it comes to the speaking, the biggest piece of feedback I have is stage side leads.
Okay.
So last year I did a gig in Toronto with 3,000 people in the audience.
3,000? Is that the largest crowd you've ever presented to?
I think so. If not, it's close. I'm pretty sure it's the largest. So that was at the convention center. There's not a lot of rooms that fit that many people. Right. The next stage is auditoriums, which are what's the word? Like the Scotiabank Center and stuff like that. Yep. That's the next stage. Like there's kind of nothing in between.
3,000 is humongous. Like that's a big crowd. Yeah.
Yeah. It's great. And it was wonderful. It was a wonderful experience. And it was part of a tour that I was doing. And I've been doing so much work in Toronto this year because of that gig last June that I'm not traveling as much. I may actually lose my status on Air Canada.
Oh, jeez.
So that
you'll be flying private, don't worry.
So that is a measure of success in that, when I ask people, how did you find out about me? Oh, we saw you. A friend of ours was in that audience. So when word of mouth spreads like that from one event, it was a home run.
Absolutely.
And so one of the big measures is stage side leads. But even before that, it is, what are the looks on the faces? How many people are waiting to talk to you after it's done? And not everybody wants to talk to you because sometimes they're rushing off to something else. Sometimes I was just told yesterday, you're so approachable, which is lovely for me to hear. But there's that element. How many messages am I getting from people afterwards? How much are people sharing it? Like, it really has a lot of qualitative looks on faces.
Sure.
Sometimes you're on stage, you're like, I can totally see their faces. They're in with me. They're on the edge of their seats. And you're like, I'm doing it. This is great. Sometimes it's crickets, and I think it's gone terribly.
Yep.
And then I get phone calls after that going, hey, we saw you at this thing. We'd love to bring you in. I'm like, really? I had no idea y'all liked me because it was like crickets in that room. So it's very hard to measure that kind of stuff. But usually it's the word of mouth stuff.
It's the word of mouth,
it's been going well.
I mean, that's incredible to be presenting in front of 3,000 people and then you just get more business from that. There's a few things I want to ask. Advice. There's so much advice that you have. There's the negotiation side, details. Talk to me advice on just presenting, whether it's on stage, whether it's in a meeting, whether it's in a job interview. What are some things that people should be doing, should not be doing, just from communication, from body language, from anything? Like, how would you consult someone?
So I always tell people how you show up matters. If you are somebody who is looking like this and biting your nails and, drumming your fingers on the table and so on, when people see that, they don't see you as credible. If you are looking like you have self-doubt, then I'm going to doubt you too. So how you physically show up when we talk about body language, when you're taking up more space, when you look relaxed, when you look poised. And it's not always relaxed. Maybe you want to be passionate. It's not relaxed. Maybe you want to look like you're really eager, and that's cool too. It depends on the circumstances, but how you show up, that context, whatever it is, do you look like you deserve to be there? Do you look like you are credible? Those are the questions I want people to ask themselves. So usually that means taking up more physical space. Usually being small means you're not going to get very far. People are going to see you as small. Those are the little teeny things that we can do. And you know, there's lots of tricks that, like power poses. Dr. Amy Cuddy introduced us to power poses. So the Wonder Woman pose and the V for Victor, these things take up more physical space. We know not only are they communicating to somebody that I deserve to be here, I'm credible, I'm worthy, I am authoritative, and so on, but there's also psychology behind the more you do this and tell others that, the more your brain will catch up to what your body is telling others. So you can actually psych yourself up instead of psyching yourself out. Having an inner monologue before you go in there. Again, do you deserve to be there? Of course you do. You're on the meeting invitation. Like, I speak to audiences all the time where we're sitting at a table like this, a giant boardroom, and so there's chairs lined up against the table, but then there's a perimeter of chairs around the room because there's not enough for everybody to sit at the table. And I see people who will go and choose, it's usually women, who will go and choose the seat at the wall instead of at the table. And I'm like, why aren't you physically taking a seat at the table? This is not a figurative thing. This is literally, why aren't you taking a seat at the table? I'm like, well, I'm not the most senior person in the room and stuff, so I don't know if I deserve to be there. I'm like, were you on the invitation? If you were on the invitation, you deserve to be there. Now, the other thing is, if, let's say, the table is full and now the CEO comes in and the CEO needs a seat, you are in a position of power because you have that seat at the table. If you were sitting in the back, you wouldn't be in a position for anybody to notice you. But now you are in a position of power. You have something that is valuable, and you get to stand up and say, hey, I came early and got this seat. I'm happy to give it up today. I'm sure somebody can give it up next time. You take my seat. And now you just gave them something that's valuable. So now they're noticing that, oh, you do show up early. You are somebody who is here and is worthy and so on. And they noticed you. They know who you are. They also now feel indebted to you. And that's huge because there's a reciprocity in our subconscious brain. There's a social norm that we have. And I think this is the norm everywhere I've ever been to in the world. I've never read anything to the contrary that says it doesn't exist in some country. But there's this element of reciprocity. When you do something for someone, they want to do something for you. They may not consciously recognize they want to do it, but they might go, yeah, you know what? They did something nice for me. So when I have the opportunity, it might be in 2 minutes, in 2 years, and in 2 months, I'm going to do something nice for them. So now maybe the CEO knows your name and will mention you or invite you or whatever. They'll be more open to taking your call because they go, oh yeah, you're the one. I want to invite you in.
Well, what was that statement you said? That was actually important. Is that, I'll give you my seat. Maybe next time someone else can. What's that?
So that one I'm really particular with because it's not okay for you just to be constantly be the one giving things up.
Right.
I don't want you to be seen as the weakling that's always going to give it up. Because let's say there's 10 people around the table and it's always you doing it. Then there's going to be an expectation that we can just push you around.
Yes.
And I don't want anybody to have that expectation. And so I will say something to the effect of encouraging others to do it next time or establishing that I'm not going to be taken advantage of without being aggressive about it by saying, you know, hey, I got here early. I'm happy to give up my seat this time. Next time somebody else can do it. Maybe it's just throwing that in, but it's just even that saying this time as opposed to assuming it's every time. Like I still remember being, and this goes along with this confidence and how you present. I was working for an organization where I was the most senior woman in the entire company, which was ridiculous at under 30. And I was in a room, I was on this executive team in New York City where I was the same as everybody else. It was my peer group. And my boss, who was the only more senior person in the room, said, hey, Fotini, can you take notes on this? Can you take minutes since you're good at it? And I was like, no, I can't. And like people were taking it back. It's all men and me.
Yes.
No, I can't. Because what's going to happen when I'm not here? And if I'm the one taking minutes, then I can't participate and be using my active brain in this conversation because I'm so busy keeping track of what you guys do. So I'm going to recommend we take turns on who takes minutes because we're all peers. And so who'd like to go first? That's
amazing.
Right? I'm not going to be put in a small place. I'm not going to be aggressive about it. I'm not going to be rude about it. So instead of, saying, how dare you treat me like a secretary, and there's nothing wrong with being a secretary if that's what you want to be, but that was not my role.
Absolutely.
It's going, well, if I'm taking minutes, how am I going to participate? And if I'm the one who's so good at taking minutes and you guys don't develop that skill set, what happens when I'm out with a client and can't make this meeting and I can't see what's going on? It's just challenging them right back in a productive way, in a collaborative way. Again, this is one of the tools in the book. It's about asking questions instead of banging your fist on the table.
Right.
You can get to the same place without being perceived as aggressive. You can be assertive without being aggressive. So those little things in terms of how you show up, how you demonstrate that you deserve to be in that room, it's not about being arrogant, it's about being confident. And there's a fine line between those two.
There is a fine line. This feedback is incredible. What do you do when you're faking that confidence? You're going into a meeting, you know you're not as important or carry enough weight as the person across that you're negotiating with, or if you're going for that job interview, you're physically not larger and creating a presence, or, that whole fake it till you make it, you can filter through the bullshit. What advice do you have for those people going in there? Is it just trial and error? Like you have to build up your resume? How do you coach that?
So there's two things. One of it is practice makes progress. So just get used to being in those rooms and it won't be quite as daunting when you are in them. But the more important thing is, what is your purpose for being in that room? There's a reason why they called you in to be there. One of the things that I talk about when I do consulting with clients is we talk about role play. Who's going to do what in that room? And sometimes someone's going to be a speaker, and sometimes someone's going to be a figures person and writing everything down. And sometimes someone's going to be an observer. And oftentimes that observer whose job is to say nothing, is to just pay attention to what's happening in that room and who's, responding to what and how did they react to it and what does that mean and so on. That can be the most important role in the room. So it might be a very junior person who's doing that, but that person has a purpose to being in that room. Just because they're not speaking, just because they're not running numbers, doesn't mean they're just sitting there idly twiddling their thumbs. They have a purpose for being in that room. And when you know your purpose, when you can deliver something, then you have a lot more confidence.
Yes.
So even if you're the junior person in the room, you have something to contribute. Because you have a set of eyes that's not busy trying to write things down or trying to do this other thing. So what is your contribution? If you are that person who has been invited in for an interview and you go, but there's like 10 other people behind me who've been invited in, but they chose you.
Yeah.
Why? Remind yourself of that. Give yourself that pep talk. I might not be the biggest person in the room, but people tell me I have a presence when I show up. I'm 5'5" on a good day. I'm wearing heels today. But even so, I'm still shorter than you in this chair. You take up more space in the chair than I do, but it doesn't matter because of the way I am perceived as how I show up, right?
Yes.
I'm perceived as if I walk in like I'm 6 feet tall because of how I show up, because of the tone of my voice, because I'm not wavering in my voice. I'm not gravelly in my voice. I'm not like trailing off, right? I talk to one of my nieces all the time and she trails off. I go, Evie, you need to speak up. I can't hear you.
Yes.
It's those little things that I want to coach, especially young girls, into doing to make sure that their voice is heard physically as well as figuratively. There's these things that you can do, but it really starts with that pep talk in your brain. Mm-hmm. So Amy Cuddy coined the phrase, don't fake it till you make it, fake it till you become it. Right? So this power pose thing, it convinces your brain. There's another study that I love talking about from the stage where they told people in a 2013 Harvard study, they had people sing in front of a group. Now, I'm no stranger to a microphone, but it does cause a lot of stress for people. And so what they did is they told them, before you go on stage, they gave 3 different groups 3 different sets of instructions. So they told the first group, I want you to tell yourself, regardless of how you're feeling, I want you to tell yourself, I am anxious. And they told the second group, I want you to tell yourself, I am excited. And they told the third group, nothing at all. That was our control group. And what ended up happening is, according to a computer that measured each singer's volume and pitch, the group that told themselves, I am excited, outperformed the other 2 groups. Now, some might think it's coincidence there was better singers in that group, but according to the computer, they also did the same thing on a math test and a speech test. That's not coincidence.
Right.
That is telling your brain to psych yourself up instead of psyching yourself out. Give yourself a purpose for being there. Remember even things like mentorship. Mentors love giving wisdom, but there's this element of reverse mentorship. There's stuff they don't know that's happening at the ground level. If you're in the C-suite, you don't know what's happening at the ground level. You are now a source of information for that person in the C-suite. You are now a source of a guide for the next generation that's coming in because they don't get that generation. The boomers, the Gen Xers, the millennials, they don't know what the Gen Zs are thinking. So if you're in that group, you can educate them. You now have a purpose for being in that room, but it really requires the mental piece before anything else.
Absolutely. Pause. Like that resonated with me when we did your workshop is the whole pause button. And I've factored that in because I feel I'm the type of guy, I hate when there's quiet. I hate when there's a pause in conversation. Yeah. And oftentimes I used to just fill it up with space, and most of it's just 80% bullshit when you just try to fill it up. So part of that was just pause. Think about it. It's okay to say, let me get back to you. Talk to me about the power of pause. So
we don't pause because we're trying to soothe. It's uncomfortable. It's awkward. But the more comfortable you get with that discomfort, the more confident you're actually going to look. And so a lot of people make the false assumption that if I'm not saying something, I'm going to look stupid. And so that drives a lot of our behavior. This anxiety of I'm going to look stupid. It's the same fear that I talked about earlier. That drives so much of us filling the silence. Or maybe I'm soothing myself, but I might also be trying to soothe you because I don't want you to be uncomfortable in this pause. So let me just keep thinking and talking at the same time. And that can get us into trouble.
Yeah.
So that can make us look even more stupid. We say things we regret. You have those moments where you go, oh God, why did I do that? Or why did I say that? But you can look far more poised. So part of this is perception, is managing perceptions by just shutting up for a second and by owning that pause, by saying, I need a moment to think about that. Or you gave me a really great question. I want to make sure I give you an answer that's not going to be false or that's not going to cause concern. Let me think about that for a second. Or I need to think through what the consequences are of those numbers, or do I even have the right numbers? Give me a second for that. Whatever it is, you can just say, I need a moment. And now you own that moment and think of how confident it looks. If you can say, give me a moment. You're not asking, can I have a minute? It's give me a minute. I'm in charge of this moment. You are now not going to intrude on this space that I've created. I'm doing it politely.
Does it show weakness or that you're not prepared if you do that too much? Like, aren't you the person that has the answers? Why do you always need to pause? Like, that's what I've struggled with sometimes.
But if you can say to somebody, I want to give you the best answer. Don't you think they're going to be more pleased versus let me think and talk at the same time?
Sure.
I want to give you something that I know is going to be thoughtful, that I know is going to be useful to you. Give me a second to think that through. Now all of a sudden you're giving that a positive purpose. And now it's looking far more confident than the alternative. If you did it twice and played the video back, which one's going to look better? I do this video stuff with my clients all the time. And until they see it, they don't believe it, right? Just that you might be freaking out on the inside. And I've done this. I remember one of the very first times I ran a workshop by myself. I had a C-level executive from Walmart. I was training him, and I had a junior account manager from some supplier company because it was a mix of companies. It was an open workshop. So super senior Walmart guy that this person would never interact with on another occasion. Like this junior person would never cross paths with him. And I have them conducting a negotiation, a 5-minute negotiation, and I'm videotaping it. And this young girl looks so quiet and so poised. She's just she's just sitting there. He's talking and talking and talking, getting aggressive and leaning forward and doing all these things. And she's just sitting back in her chair and just looking at him, saying nothing. And he's talking himself out of a deal. He's just giving her proposal after proposal after proposal. Senior executive. Yeah, this is a C-suite guy. He became one of the presidents of Walmart.
Okay.
He's no longer in that position. So this is the level of seniority.
She took his position? Is that what happened?
She never worked for that company. But so he's talking himself out of a deal, just giving away value and dropping his price and dropping his price and dropping his price. And then finally, I give him the 5-second warning, last few seconds. And she says, okay. And as soon as I turn off the video camera, she falls apart. She's like, oh my God. Like no one knew it. In her head, she was the most nervous person in the universe. She was like mentally going, I just don't know what to say.
She was collective and calm.
But she looked so outwardly, she looked so calm. Everyone's like, you're a freaking rock star. But they didn't see, when I showed the video in the classroom afterwards, they didn't see what happened after I turned off the camera. And I pulled her aside and go, do you realize what you just did? You shook down the C-level executive of one of the biggest companies on the planet. That's what you're capable of. But even in the moment, she didn't think she was capable of it. Wow. But because she played this role of, I don't know what to say, so I'm just going to say nothing, it worked so well for her. And so now she has that experience to give her the confidence to go, oh, this actually worked. Yes. So now I'm going to positive reinforcement. I'm going to do this over and over again. So if you own that presence, if you don't look like you're falling apart, that fake it till you become it becomes a reality.
Absolutely.
That for me was one of the most powerful examples I've ever seen. I'm so glad I was in that room at that time.
That's incredible. Part of this last segment, I want to talk about cultures when it comes to negotiation, right? There's different cultures are known or have generalization or certain traits on negotiating. When I'm in Asia, China, they're masters at pause and silence. And there's obviously a language barrier.
Yeah.
But there's, working over there where, again, I've improved myself over the years on, they're quiet. They don't like what I'm saying. Let me say something. How do you coach through different cultures, or is it the same type of characteristics across the board? So
I would say I would replace the word culture with context.
Okay.
So you need to know the context of what you're getting yourself into. And that context might be different geographically. That context might be different even within the same geography with a different person. And so when I'm teaching MBA classes, most of my MBA classes are a mix of international students. I have a lot of students from India and a lot of students from China. And in India, there's a certain type of negotiation that's extremely common when you go to markets and stuff like that. We don't go to the market in Canada and negotiate the way this happens over in other parts of the world. And you and I are used to it because we see it in Greece.
Yep.
This is very common outside of countries like Canada and the US. And maybe in certain contexts, even in, like if you go to a flea market or something like that, there might be some room. But we don't do it nearly as much here. In terms of frequency, as is done in other parts of the world.
The price is the price here, and that's it, right? Yes.
Or people are too afraid to do it because it's just not common. Like we learned by osmosis because we watched our parents doing it and our grandparents doing it and everybody else. It was a normal thing for us. So it wouldn't be so weird for us to do it. But everybody that I grew up with in Canada would be like, what are you doing?
What are you doing? Yeah, exactly.
So context matters. But I even tell those students, if you're sitting in a room in Canada like us, and you're sitting across from someone who is from India, who you know has done that in the past, you don't know if they've assimilated to the Canadian culture. So are they going to behave like they did when they were in that context, or are they going to behave and assimilate to this context? So you really need to understand who's sitting across from you right now. So culture is an element of context. It's one piece of data that we have to decide how am I going to handle this particular situation. Even down in the US, like I find negotiating in the Northeast very different from negotiating in the South. Everybody in the South is very polite, so you never actually hear the word no. But they're telling you no.
Yes.
So you need to know, what does no actually look like down in the South.
Absolutely, yes.
Right? It's a very different context with the same people, with the same culture theoretically, but there's microcultures even in the States.
Yeah.
So we have to understand the context and take their culture, their background, their DNA and all that kind of stuff into account, but marry it with all of the other things that are also going on in that space and in their experience. They have a very different experience than you, no matter what. You and I have different experiences, even though we had similar upbringings. Yep. We still have different experiences that led us here. So you might approach things differently than I would. I need to stop and think, what is the context he's coming from so that I can approach appropriately?
Yeah. So context, not culture, is what. Last question I have for you. Advice. You're obviously an expert. Talk to me just about relationship advice when it comes to communication, whether it's with a spouse, a friend. You know, what are common things that you always hear on, you know, my husband or my wife or my boyfriend or girlfriend or whatever it is? What's something that you always hear that some advice the listeners could take away today and not piss off their significant other?
Well, one of the funniest things that I ever heard was, so I give out these little cards that have a pause button on them to remind people. Because not only do you look more poised, but it gives your brain a chance to not be reactive, right? So there's two reasons to say less. One is so you look more credible, but the other is to allow your brain a chance to do its best work. Because if we're being reactive, we're probably not doing our best work. So I give these little pause cards as a reminder and stickers and stuff like that. And people years later still tell me that they have it in their wallet and on their screensaver and whatever it is. And it's great. It's a nice visual reminder to make it sticky. Mm-hmm. And one of my students told me, he goes, yeah, I have them all over the place. I even have one on my nightstand. I go, why your nightstand? And he goes, now I don't get into arguments with my wife.
Oh, jeez.
And it's really as simple as that. If you can pause your brain to not react, to not be defensive, if you can pause and even take it a step further and put yourself in their shoes, why would they be saying that right now? When I deal with really difficult people, and it's being able to pause myself and go, this isn't about me. This is about them and their experience. What experience led them to this? Why would they be saying this right now? If you can pause to create that level of empathy, and remember, empathy is not agreement. Just because I'm seeing where you're coming from doesn't mean I'm going to agree with what you said. I'm just trying to understand where you're coming from so I can approach in a slightly different way.
You're acknowledging what they're saying?
Yes, that word acknowledgement is incredibly important. People want to feel acknowledged. Yes. That's all it comes down to. So if you're negotiating with your little kid and they say, I want to go jump out of the tree and be Superman in my costume, you can tell them you're not going to do that and they're going to be upset. But you can also say, I know it really sucks that we can't jump out of trees like that because we're going to break our legs and so on. And all of a sudden the heaving crying starts to calm down because they feel acknowledged. You understand me, right? So the result is not going to change. I'm still not going to let you jump out of a tree.
Right.
But that acknowledgement sometimes is all people need. It's that sigh of relief. I know it really sucks when we can't do that. I know it's really difficult to hear these types of things. Now, it's not it doesn't save you from everything. It doesn't save all of the drama, but it can reduce a lot of the drama. So give yourself a chance to come up with what is the best solution, what are the best choices of words here before I say something I'm going to regret, and then pause to think, where are they coming from? Why is this coming up? Oftentimes we can understand there's actually some subtext here. There's something that I need to address. This is a symptom of a much bigger problem. Yeah. And so when you can pause to tune into that. That's a very powerful thing.
Yeah. And everyone has a story.
Yeah.
Right. Everyone's struggling with something. Everyone's fighting something. You know, the older I get, I try to do it more. It's tough. A lot of times if you're heated or if you're whatever and you want to respond and, you know, it's a challenge, but it's something, even with kids, having kids and trying to do that, not slap them in the head with a slipper when they want to jump.
What I haven't done.
Yeah. And we turned out okay, you know. Do you follow a lot of your advice? Like, is it easy for you to implement it in your life?
It's easier.
Okay.
But I would never say it's easy. Because pausing sounds like the simplest thing in the world, but it is the hardest thing to do.
Yes.
And so the closer I am to something, the more connected, the more heated I am about something, the more difficult that is for me. But because I've practiced it so much, it is something that I can tune into a lot faster than perhaps I would have in the past. Yes. I do think it's improved my personal relationships, certainly with people like my dad, because we used to get into a lot of fights when I was growing up, but I have a different approach now. I have more patience now because I can train myself to go, just take a breath, Fotini. Or when I'm, you know, texting is a big thing now in our universe that didn't exist when we were kids. Right. So you want to hit send right away? Take a moment to think about it.
Yeah.
Before you send an email, take a breath, maybe sleep on it. I do that a lot, and that's easy for me to do now, to be able to take that pause.
Because you want to respond in the moment, prove your point, do whatever.
Yeah, when I'm really fired up, but I take the time to turn down. Even just now, before we came here today, I was ghost texting for a friend.
Oh, jeez.
So her and her ex-husband have a lot of conflict. She sends me the text messages. I resend them and I help her to craft the appropriate messaging. Yeah. And I'm like, take this, think about it, marinate it on it for a second. I'm going into a meeting. Don't send anything right away. We also knew he's on a plane right now. It's best to give him this message after he gets off the plane because he's going to stew there on the plane for a really long time. So how do we manage that conflict? A lot of it has to do with just pausing and thinking things through before you hit send really quickly.
It's great advice. I'm going to get a pause button tattooed on my forearm just to remember.
I've thought about it.
Yeah, you thought about it. That's dedication to Fotini. You're amazing. I appreciate you sitting down. I want to be able to do this. You were, when I wanted to launch this podcast, you were on my top to get in front of because you're doing amazing things. We have a great friendship. And I only want to do these things in person. So finally our schedule is linked up.
Yeah.
So thank you so much. We're going to share all your links. Anything else you want to share with the listeners, where they could find you, where we could buy this? Let's talk about that.
So fortunately, the book is everywhere. Your favorite retailer, all of the major retailers have them, which is pretty cool. Amazon does as well. If you've read it, if you could leave it a review, I would be incredibly grateful because that's what tells other people to want to read it as well. So the book is everywhere. I mean, on my website, you can find all my details. I share a lot more on Instagram than I do on LinkedIn, but I'm getting better at sharing more on LinkedIn again. Right. But I also have a gift for all of your listeners. So if you go on my website to fotiniicon.com/quiz, I shorten the name so people don't get it wrong.
Perfect. Yes.
So fotiniicon.com/quiz, you can learn your personal negotiation style. So what is your autopilot mode? What are some of the pros and what are some of the watch outs for that? So the more aware you are, the easier it is to access that pause button.
That's amazing. We'll get the link up there and I'll make sure everybody gets that filled out.
Wonderful.
You're amazing. Thank you so much.
Thank you, my friend.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Invigorate Your Business with George Stroumboulis. Please hit the subscribe and like buttons and follow me on all the main podcast streaming channels. Also, please share your comments when you can. I appreciate your help in expanding this network to a worldwide audience. Until next time, stay invigorated.